So with the winder done and the UVs moved into position, I'm going to move on to the shot count frame, which is this little guy in here. And as you can see, basically it's just a very, very simple object. We've got this outer side of the frame and then this inner part of the frame. Now what I'm going to do is start by just actually unwrapping it as it stands to see if we can get away with not selecting any edges. So I'm just going to click once in UV space. You can see that things actually look pretty good. Now I've got the red section over here in the 3D view, which tells me that seal holes is on, so I'm just going to try that off. You can see we get a little bit more distortion in there. So with this on, with the seal holes on, I'm just going to click space to drop the tool, and I'm going to apply the material to this to see what it looks like. So I'm quickly going to add in that details black metal material, just see if we've got any kind of weird distortion going on. And actually that looks pretty good. So I think, for the most part, this object is now done. So I'm just going to size up the size of the checkers in relation to the other parts of the object, and then move on to the shutter dial box. Now, as you can see, for the most part, this object pretty much resembles a box. We've got these kind of two corners here, although they are indeed curved, and we have these two sharp ones at this end. So we're going to treat it exactly the same as we would if we were UVing a cube. So the first thing I want to do is basically split off this top section. So I'm going to go in and double click the edge loop surrounding that entire part of the model. The next thing I want to do is double click these back edges, and just double click those so that they can unfold along these points. Now obviously we can't really select any edges here without destroying the flow of the texture along these curves, so I'm going to leave this all as one giant piece. Next we have this frame that sits just inside him. We want to separate this out. We now know that we have to go in and double click an edge loop running around that section. And then on the top we have this detail that is built into the model. So we want to separate out this entire section. So it's just a case of going in and double clicking an edge loop running around that entire part of the model. Now with that done, you can see that we've got some extra details inside here. We've got a couple of extrusions and obviously this frame running around the middle here. However, this might UV okay. So one thing to do would be to go up and check it. So I'm just going to UV unwrap that. And the bit we're looking for is this section here, which is the obviously the top faces of this object, and then this section, which is this frame that sits on top that we've separated out. And as you can see, we don't get any overlapping sections. There are no red parts on the UV map whatsoever. The red section over here in the 3D view tells me that seal holes is on, so I'm just going to try that off. And you can see that things look a lot more distorted, so that's really doing wonders for our UV map at the moment. But yeah, the fact that we're not getting any overlaps or any kind of big distortions in there, I'm really happy with that. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, sort out the UVs, apply the material, and we'll move on to the next object. So we're now going to start work on the shutter button. Now this is actually in two parts. If you go to polygon mode and double click this middle section, you can see that we have these connected polygons, and then we have this entire bottom section of the model. So what I'm going to do is just double click this top section and shift H to hide the other part. Then we can go in and UV this part to begin with. Now what I want to do is basically separate out several of these sections. So I'm going to separate out this middle part. So I'm going to go in and add in an edge loop just there. In fact, I might add it just one lower, so just we kind of hide that seam just kind of inside that indent a little bit. And with that done, I'm going to go in and actually add another edge just down the bottom there as well. Now we want to go in and add an edge at the top of here to separate out these faces. I'm going to separate out this gap, so add another edge just there. And then the rest of those polygons can remain entirely connected, I think. Now we do want to go in and add some edges to split up these small loops of polygons. So I'm going to add in a couple of edges in that gap. And I'm also going to do the exact same thing right in the middle here, like so. Now we're going to try and see if we can get away with not adding a row of edges around this outer section, as I don't really want a seam there. So we may have to come back and kind of sort that out in a minute, but for now I'm going to go up and try and unwrap. And you can see that things are actually looking pretty good. Now this is with seal holes on. With seal holes off, this loop running around the outside completely distorts. So seal holes on is doing quite a lot of work for us there. And things look really, really good. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, grab all of those UVs and move them over to the left. Hit U to bring back the other part. Double click it and isolate it with Shift H. Then we can go in and start splitting this up. Now, for the most part, this object resembles a cylinder. However, it does have this one kind of weird extrusion on this one side. That's going to cause us a little bit of trouble. But remember, if there's bits that you don't know how to UV, just separate them off from the bits that you do know how to UV. So what I'm going to do is treat this exactly as if it was a cylinder, but just separate out this box section and treat it like a box. So the first thing I want to do is come down here to the bottom. In fact, I'm just going to hide a couple of these mesh layers just so we can see what's going on. Now I'm going to double click this edge loop to separate off this bottom section of the model. Then I'm going to select the edge loop running around the top, which will separate out the top faces. Now we need to go in and manually select another couple of edges in there, and this splits off this entire top ring from this box section. So now we have the three sections. We have the top, the bottom, and this middle part. Now we want to separate out the box from the middle section, so I'm just going to add in a loop of edges running around the box. And then we need this middle section of the cylinder to unfold into UV space, so we need to add in a couple of edges. I'm just going to hide them underneath the extrusion in there. And now we need the box section, this extrusion, to UV to unfold into a net shape. And we know to do that we need to select the corners. So I'm going to go in and select the three edges on each of the four corners in here. And fingers crossed, it should look okay. You can see that things actually look pretty good. Now I'm just going to turn on seal holes quickly just to see if we get a little bit of a better shape there, and you can see straight away that we do. With seal holes on, this looks a lot better. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. I'm going to zoom out a little bit and hit U to bring back the other part of the model. Now it's just a case of arranging these as we have done with the many other objects on the camera, and then we'll move on. Now with that done, I'm going to move on to the self-timer light, and this is a very simple object. We just have this bulb section in the middle, we have this kind of loop of polygons running around the outside, and then the polygons that separate those two areas. So I'm going to split up those three sections. I'm going to add in a loop running around the top like that, a loop running around the base of the bulb, and then a couple of edges just joining those two loops up so that it can unwrap, and that should hopefully look pretty good. So I'm going to go to unwrap and click. And you can see that we get a really good result already. Now I'm just going to try it with seal holes on, and you can see that things look a lot more distorted, so I'm going to turn that off, and yeah, I'm happy with that result, so I'm going to hit space, apply the material, and arrange the UVs. So we're now going to move on to the shutter lock top, which is, believe it or not, pretty much the easiest object to UV on the entire camera. It's just a case of doing absolutely nothing whatsoever. So I'm just going to come up to the unwrap tool and click once, and believe it or not, we're done. So it's just a case of rearranging those UVs, adding your material, and we can move on to the shutter lock object, which is perhaps a little bit more complex. Now the shutter lock object actually has three sections to it. We have this plate, the kind of thumb thing that sits on the plate, and this outer frame. And we're going to deal with this frame first and get it over and done with. So I'm going to hit Shift H to isolate it, and I'm just going to hide these other mesh layers above it. Now, if we look at this, there are a couple of sections that might be good kind of candidates for being separated out. First of all, we have all of these front faces that look like they could probably be kind of kept together, kept linked up in UV space, so that would be one section. The next section would probably be the outer kind of loop of polygons that runs around the entire model. Then I'd be tempted to separate out these top sections into their own parts, and then this middle loop as well. So there's a couple of things in there. We need to surround each one of those sections with a loop of edges. So I'm going to go in and start double clicking. So I'm going to add in a loop of edges to separate out the sides first of all. So we've added that loop running all the way around there. Then I'm going to bring this back up to the top corner. And now we've completely separated out the side faces of the model. So now I'm going to separate out the front. So I'm going to come in and double click this edge loop to begin with. And then make sure that we add in edges, completely splitting off these front faces, just like so. Now we want to separate out these middle faces running around this hole, so I'm going to come up and we have to make a choice whether we want to separate it there or separate it there. Now I think this is probably going to be less of a visible seam, so I'm going to go in and double click these edges, which means that these faces will be part of this top section. Now there is another little section to watch on this top part of the model, and that's this set of edges in here. Now this might not necessarily unwrap correctly if we don't select anything, but it's certainly worth a go. So I'm going to come up and click unwrap and click once. And you can see that these sections all look pretty good, and the top sections down here, I want to zoom in and take a look at that corner, and that's this section in here. Now you can see that we're not getting any red on the UV map, so there's no overlapping sections. In fact, things look pretty much as I would hope. So before I call this done, I really would like to check it, just to make sure that the distortions aren't too noticeable. So what I'm going to do is hit space, I'm going to go to polygon mode and apply our material. Then I'm going to grab these polygons in our UV map and scale them up slightly, just to scale up our checkered pattern there. And you can see that we are getting a little bit of distortion on this corner, but considering this is just a base texture, there's just going to be scratches and things, I don't think this is going to be too noticeable at all, so I'm perfectly happy to call this done. So I'm just going to undo that scaling, and then it's just a case of arranging these UVs. I'm just going to chuck these off to the side just for the moment, bringing back our other sections, and then we can move on to this back plate. So with those polygons selected, I'm going to click Shift H to isolate them. Now, as you can probably see, this is, for the most part, just a curved box. So we're going to UV it exactly as if it was a normal cube. So the first thing I want to do is select all of these corner edges, like so. Then we want to select the edges running around 3 of the sides of this back set of faces. So I'm going to go in and start selecting a couple of edges just along the top like that, all the way to the corner. And then all the way down the side, like so, and then make sure I get rid of that guy, and then grab all the ones running across the bottom to the other corner. Now by keeping this edge unselected, when we click unwrap, these back faces will unfold so that they sit next to these front ones, which you'll see if I click unwrap and then click. So we end up with something which is like the cover of a book. It's just kind of been opened up and laid flat. So this is exactly what I was looking for, so I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. I'm just going to grab these guys and move them off to the side slightly. Now with that done, I'm going to hit U to unhide everything else and select this section in here, and then I'm going to hit Shift H to isolate it. Now this object does look a little bit tricky, however, as long as we kind of follow the rules that we've been following thus far, it really isn't. Basically, what we want to do is decide where we're happy to have a seam. Now, first of all, I'd say probably around this outside set. So we could split off all of these outer faces from these ones in the middle. So why don't we go in and do that straight away? So I'm going to double-click this top loop, double-click this bottom loop, then it's just a case of going in, selecting one edge on each of these guys. And at any point, if you double click, it will select all of these loops. So that's what I'm doing. It's just a quicker way of selecting lots of edge loops, basically. So just double click to get all of them. Now do the same thing on the other side. So I'm just going to go in and select one edge just at any point along these loops, making sure we don't get any ones we don't want. So just continue down. Think of some jokes or something, shouldn't I? There you go. So with all of these guys in place, we've now separated out these outer set of polygons. Now why don't we go and take a look what happens when we unwrap. So I'm just going to click once, and you can see that we get this section, which is the middle, and that actually looks pretty good. We're not getting any overlapping sections in there at all. Then we have this section, which is this outer loop, and it's having a hard time trying to unwrap that, as there are no edges selected to allow it to unfold into a long, thin strip. However, before we add those edges in, let's see if we can get away with not doing that by coming over and clicking Seal Holes. And you can see that straight away things look pretty much perfect. In fact, there's no overlapping polygons in here. This section over here is perhaps a little bit more distorted. If you compare this section, so we have this, then one of those, and then one like that. Then we have the same on the other side, but this bottom one, this last little indent, is very kind of distorted towards the bottom. So what we could do is just play around with a couple of these options in here. That's clearly wrong. I don't know what's going on there. So I'm going to click X, and you can see that this now matches much more closely on either side. It's kind of like a mirror image of each other, basically. There's a little bit of distortion at the top, but nothing too much to worry about. So I'm going to call that done. So I'm going to click space to drop the tool, U to bring back the other sections. Now it's just a case of adding in the material to these other two sections, sorting out our UVs, and then we can move on to the final objects. So with the shutter lock done, we're moving on to the dials item. Now this, it really is just ridiculously simple at this point. After all that we've done, it's just 2 cylinders. There's nothing more to it than that. So hopefully I shouldn't have to explain to you stage by stage exactly what to do at this point, but just in case, I'm going to select these 2 very edge loops like so. Then I'm going to select some edges that will link the 2 on each part of the dial, so on that bottom one and on this top one as well. And that is it. So I'm just going to come up and unwrap and click. And you can see that we get all of the different sections of the model. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. I'm going to put that back into subdivision surface mode. Now all I need to do is organize these UVs and apply our material, and all of our top items will have been UV'd. So moving on to our lens object, as you can see, it really is just a whole bunch of cylinders stuck next to each other. And we already have at least two ways with which we can unwrap cylinders. However, there are a couple parts of this model which are going to cause us a couple of little problems, and things won't unwrap perhaps as easily as we would have liked. So I'm going to be introducing you to two new tools which we can use to kind of help that process along and make our job a little bit easier. Now the first thing we want to do is create a new UV map just for our lens object. So I'm going to come over and click New Map and call it Lens Base and click Enter. We get our new map in our UV Maps list. Then I'm just going to double click this back section of the lens and click Shift H to isolate it. Now at the moment we have two methods we could use to unwrap this object. First of all, we come up and click Unwrap with no edges selected whatsoever, and if we just click and then turn on Seal Holes, we get a circular shape that is actually a really nice unwrapping of this cylinder. So this is a perfectly valid method. Now another method we could use would be to come in and select a loop of edges running from one side of the shape to the other side, and this would allow it to unfold into a long thin chain of polygons. So let's try that one. I'm going to come up and click Unwrap and click once, and you can see that it looks a bit weird first of all, but if we now go in and turn off Seal Holes, things look a lot better, much more like what we'd expect. So these are two perfectly valid methods of unwrapping this shape. There is, however, a third option, and that's the UV peeler tool that you can find over here on the left underneath UV Relax. Now to use the UV peeler tool, we need to go in and double click an edge loop running around the very outer edge of our object. So I'm just going to double click that very outside edge in there. And with that selected, I'm going to come over and click UV Peeler and click once in UV Space. Now straight away you can see that we get a very different result than we had with the other two techniques. Whereas with those two techniques we had a very thin line of polygons. In this one we filled the entire UV space with UVs. We also have a couple of extra things. We have this little blue cross down here on the left and this one up on the top right as well. We also have this blue dot in the middle. Now you may be thinking that this doesn't look exactly like this. It doesn't look like what you would expect from this UV map. However, watch what happens if I grab this little bottom blue cross and start moving it to the right. Now you can see that things start resembling the same UV map that we had with the other two techniques. We are getting that thin line of polygons. Now if you notice over here on the left we have some options, and when I moved that cross I was moving the minimum U value. So remember that U is running across the bottom and V is running up, so U is red and V is green, and basically what I'm doing is I'm saying where the blue cross is at 0.965 on the U axis. So say I wanted it to be here, which you can see is 0.4, I would set the minimum U to 0.4. and it would jump over to there. So you can get some really precise control with these values over here on the left. So at the moment all I want to do is move this over to the right until it looks roughly like the same result we had before. Now this may be slightly wrong, the aspect ratio might be slightly off, but we can always check that and scale it a little bit once we put our material on it. So for now I'm just going to set this to 0.965 and making sure that the minimum V value is 0, meaning that it will lie exactly on the edge of our UV map. I'm going to click space to drop the tool. So we now have this first part UV'd. So I'm going to grab those UVs and move those over to the left. Now I'm going to hit U to unhide everything else. I'm just going to do this technique on one other part just to make sure that we've got it down, and then I'm going to leave you to do a couple of other sections. So I'm going to grab this very next section of polygons and click Shift H to isolate it. I'm going to go in and grab the very outer edge, like so. And with that edge loop selected, I'm going to come in and click UV Peeler and click once in our viewport. And you can see it's even kept our old settings for us, so things should straight away look pretty good. So with that done, I'm going to click space to drop the tool. I'm going to grab all of these UVs and move them over to the left. Now if I hit U, you can see where we put the other ones. I'm just going to move these right up close next to those guys and hit space to drop the tool. So now I'm going to do exactly the same thing on this set of polygons and then come back. So with these polygons UV'd using the same method, I'm now going to move on to this set of polygons just inside the outer casing of our lens. So I'm going to select those guys and hit Shift H to isolate them. Now it does look a little bit more complex in here, however the lens peeler tool really is going to cope with this extraordinarily well. So I'm just going to click this outer edge loop, I'm going to come up and click UV peeler and click once in UV space. Now you can see that we've got many more polygons in this section than we did in the other parts, so this is going to have to be a little bit wider, and we know to be a little bit wider we can either manually move this cross to the left, say to about 0.8, or we could come in and use the values in here to set this precisely. So for now I'm just going to leave it about 0.8, so a little bit wider than the other parts. Hit space to drop the tool and U to bring everything back. And then we can just go and move this off to the left. Like so. Now with that done, we're going to move on to this section here. So I'm going to double click it and click Shift H to isolate it. So moving on to the grip object, you can see that there are basically three parts to it. We have the polygons to the left of the grip itself, and the polygons to the right. And the polygons on either side of the grip have a much simpler edge flow than the grip itself. Now this comes into play if we try and peel this object. So if I select this inside edge loop and come up and click UV peeler, now the peeler is not going to include the grip section of this object. In fact, if I click space and double click these UVs, you can see that these only count for the polygons up to the very, very corner of the grip. And the reason for that is that the UV peeler tool works extremely well where there's a kind of very obvious edge flow, or a very obvious poly flow through the object. But once we hit this grip section, it's not quite sure what to do, so it just stops. However, with this object, this part of the object, now UV'd, I can just grab these UVs and move them off to the right slightly. And we can do the same thing on the other side. So I'm going to grab this other edge, like so, and UV peel. And you can see again, it's not included the grip section. It's only going to have peeled up to the very corner of the grip. And you can see that if I double click these polygons, you can see it's only gone up to the very, very corner of that grip section. But with those polygons UV'd successfully, I'm going to move those off to the right as well. So now the grip section itself, if we can't peel it using the UV peeler tool, and as you might imagine, the UV unwrap tool is going to give us a little bit of a weird result due to the complex nature of the geometry, what can we do? Well, we could come up and use another tool that I've touched on very briefly in the past called the UV projection tool. Now if you click this, down under the properties we have a lot of different projection types that we can use. Now I've previously very briefly touched upon the Atlas projection type. However, if we click the drop down, we also have a cylindrical option in there. And this is the one that we're going to use. So first of all, we want to select the geometry, so I'm just going to drop that tool quickly. I'm going to select all of these UVs, which will select the polygons, and then I'm going to hit the open square bracket key, which is next to the P key on your keyboard, and this will select all of the parts of the model that aren't UV'd. So with those polys selected, I'm going to come up and click UV projection tool, and with the projection set to cylindrical and the axis set to Z, which is the axis the cylinder is facing down, I'm going to click once in the viewport. Now you can see that instantly we get this big yellow mass going on in here, and there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's clearly not the thin strip that we're looking for. However, just like the UV peeler tool, if we go in and start scaling this down, things will look a lot better. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool, and with these UVs still selected, I'm going to hit the scale tool, bring that guy up, and then scale these down on the V-axis. And you can see, as soon as I start doing this, if I start zooming in as well, we start seeing the little squares that make up our grip object. So you want this to be roughly right, like so. So I've scaled this down to 3% on V, and we end up with that long, thin strip that we're looking for. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. Now I'm going to activate the rotate tool, which is E on your keyboard, and just rotate this 90 degrees just to get it the same direction as the other parts of our UV map. And with that done, I can just drag these over to the right just to meet the other parts of that object. And I'm just going to drag all of these polygons over to meet the other UVs. In fact, we might want to start dragging them all a little bit further to the left. Now I'm just going to hit U just so I can see the other ones. And I'm just going to move these up right next to those guys, and then grab all of these UVs and just drag them slightly to the left just to give us a little bit more room. Now we're going to use exactly the same technique, the UV projection tool set to cylindrical, to unwrap this object. So I'm just going to select it and isolate it with Shift H. Then we can go in and start adding in the UVs. So without any edges selected whatsoever, I'm going to come up and click UV Projection Tool, and with Cylindrical Set, I'm going to click once in UV Space. Now you can see we get a whole bunch of yellow going on in here, and it's obviously filling up the entire space, something that we don't want. We want a long, thin strip. So I'm going to hit Space to drop the tool. I'm going to bring up the Scale tool with R and just scale these down on V slightly. Now it's sometimes easier when you're scaling like this to drop the scale tool and then reactivate it, and it just gives you a little bit finer control over what you're doing. Now a good point to look at would actually be the circle, which is this button. We want to get this so it's roughly circular, and in doing so we'll know that the aspect ratio of these UVs are about right. So that looks about right to me, so I'm going to hit Space to drop the tool. And then this part of the model is UV'd, and that, considering that it looks quite as complex as it does, that was ridiculously quick. And this is one of the reasons why Modo's UV toolset is so kind of renowned for its speed. So I'm just going to grab these UVs and rotate those 90 degrees just to match the rest of our model. I'm going to bring back the other parts of the lens, and then just drag these new UVs up right next to the other set, and then we can move on. Now before we move on to this block section down here, I've just gone ahead and UV'd two extra sections. That's this little bit here, this very thin ring that sits on top of this lens, and that was just unwrapped using the UV projection and cylindrical method. And I've also unwrapped this section just in front of it using the UV peeler method, and I've just moved the UVs over here on the right. So with that done, I'm just going to come down, and first of all we're going to UV this little kind of red dot that sits on the lens. So I'm just going to select that and isolate it with Shift H. Now UVing this is ridiculously simple. I'm just going to come up and click Unwrap and click once, and that's it done. So I'm going to hit Space to drop the tool. I'm going to scale down these UVs a little bit, and then move them over to the bottom right, like so. Then hit U to bring everything back, and then we'll work on this little button down here. So I'm going to double click it to isolate it and click Shift H. So with this now isolated, we're going to be using the same kind of selecting edges and unwrapping technique that we used for the middle and top details on the camera. So we need to find the parts that we want to separate out. Now I think the obvious bits would be to separate out this side section, and the same on the other side as well. Then we want to separate out this button and unwrap it into a net shape. So the first thing I'm going to do is just select a loop of edges running all the way around the side section of this block. So I'm just going to grab a whole bunch of edges running around the side. So this is now split off from the rest of the model. If I do that correctly, at least. There you go. And a couple of extra edges in there. So now this is completely separated off from the rest of the model. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So just grab a couple of edges in here to separate this out, like so. Now we need to separate out the indent in which this button sits, so I'm going to come in and double click a loop just inside that indent. We now want to separate out this button from the polygons that sit inside this gap, so I'm going to double click the loop at the very bottom of the button, like so. Now this loop of polygons in the gap need to separate out, be able to unfold, so I'm going to select two edges in there that just join up those two edge loops. And now we need to select the edges on the very corners of this button, so I'm going to select the three edges on each of the four corners, and this will just allow it to unfold into that net shape that we're looking for. So I'm going to carry on down, do the same thing on these bottom corners, like so. And these as well. With all of these parts of, all of these edges selected, I'm going to come up and click Unwrap and click once, and you can see that we get a really nice layout. Now this section up here, which is the polygons that sit in this gap, they're a little bit distorted, but it's nothing to worry about too much. And as you can see, the button's nicely unfolding into that net shape. So I'm now going to call this done. I'm going to arrange these UVs a little bit and then move them down to where that little red dot sits. So finally we're going to move on to the lens cap, so I'm just going to double click a polygon in the middle here to select it and Shift H to isolate it. Now you can see that for the most part it's just a cylinder, although we have these weird extrusions on the side. So just like we've done a couple times now, we're going to treat this as if it was a cylinder and then just separate out these extrusions and UV them separately. So the first thing we want to do in a cylinder is separate out the top, so I'm going to select an edge loop there, and separate out the back, so I'm going to add in an edge loop just there. Now I want to go in and isolate out these extrusions, so I'm going to add in an edge loop running all the way around the outside of both of them. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. We want to make sure that that's completed over on the other side. You can see that it hasn't, so I'm just going to continue that edge loop just to separate out those sections. And with that done, if we come up and click Unwrap and click once, we should see, for the most part, we've got a nice UV map. Now, you can see here we've got the front section that's nicely UV'd. We've got the back plate, which is this part. Now I just hit space quickly to drop the tool just to show you. So we've got this back section, which is nicely UV'd as well. And we've got these two extrusions, which are actually UV'd extremely nicely. Now we could go in and select a couple of edges in there to make it unfold into more of a net shape. However, as this is curved already, it's not going to be doing too much damage to let this kind of unfold in here. I don't think it's going to be distorting too much. Now obviously we've got a little bit of a problem with this section, and if I double click it, you can see it's actually the sides of the cylinder. So what I'm going to do is, with those polygons selected, I'm going to hit Shift H, so we just select those sections, so we just have those sections visible. Then I'm going to come up and click UV projection, and we're going to use the projection type of cylindrical and just click once. And you can see that that gives us a much better projection, although it's slightly distorted. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool and scale this down slightly, just until it looks a little bit closer to what you'd expect. Something like that looks about right to me. So I'm going to hit space to drop the tool and U to bring back the other parts of the model. Then I'm just going to move this up so it's not overlapping at all. And that part of the lens object is now done. So I'm just going to organize these UVs slightly and move them out of the way. And then we can move on to these two final blocks. Now finally, last but not least, we have these little blocks that sit on the side of the lens cap. So I'm just going to double click this first one and Shift H to isolate it. Now actually, with the polygons selected, I'm just going to Shift A to home our navigation around these polys. Now you can see that for the most part this really is just a curved cube. However, we have these holes running through the middle and this extrusion coming out the back. However, we know at this point that the bits that we're kind of not necessarily sure about, we just want to isolate them from the main part of the object. So I'm going to go in and add a loop running around this extrusion, which will separate it from the main body of this part. I'm going to go in and add a loop on either side of these polygons looping through the holes in the middle of the model, and that will just separate these out from the main part of the body as well. So with that done, we can treat the rest of it as if it was just a cube, and like a cube we want to go in and select a loop of edges on each of the corners, and then we want to select a loop running around three sides of the back section of the model, and that will keep one side unselected to allow it to unfold when we use the unwrap tool. So I'm just going to go and select those edges and then come back. So as you can see, I've just gone ahead and added in these corner edges. Now it doesn't really matter which side of the bevel you select them on, as long as you select them running all the way around. And I've done that on all of the four corners of this object. And I've also added in this loop of edges running around three sides of this entire back face. So that's just running around the entire edge. I've also added in a set of edges splitting up this part of the model so it can unwrap into a long, thin chain of polygons, and I've done the same thing for both of these. I've just selected this edge in the top corner. So with that edge selection done, I'm going to come to Unwrap and click once, and you can see that we get a really, really nice unwrap. So it's just a case of hitting space to drop the tool, and I'm going to bring back the rest of the model by hitting U. Now I'm just going to double click this section of the model. I'm going to come to Edit UVs and Copy UVs, and we're going to paste them onto this other side as we copied and pasted this into position. So with that selected now, I'm going to come to Edit and Paste, and they'll be on top of each other in the UV view, if you give it a second. So we want to select the Move tool and just move these off to the side. Now it's just a case of arranging these into a nice pattern, and then we can go about applying our material and making sure that all of these objects are the same size. So with all of our UVs applied, we're now going to apply our checkered material to this. So I'm going to select the lens complete object, hit M on my keyboard, and we're going to apply a new material. So this is going to be lens black plastic. I'm going to click OK. Then come up to our shader tree. We want to go into that material and add our image. So with the material selected, I'm going to come up to Add Layer, Image Map, select our checker 4x4, and you can see that it's already applied, so it is using the correct UV map already. However, obviously we need to kind of tile this image a little bit more. So with the image selected, I'm going to come to Properties, make sure that our Texture Locator tab is selected, and come down to Horizontal Wrap and change that to 30, and do the same to Vertical. You can see that we get a nice layout. Now at the moment things are looking a little bit odd. Some of the checkers are a little bit stretched in a couple of directions. This here is particularly stretched, as you can see. So what we want to do now is go in and alter these and scale them so that all of the checkers are kind of a uniform size across the entire model. Now the important thing is that when we're UVing and scaling this section of the model, so all of these loops up here, we don't want to scale them on the V axis. We only want to be scaling them horizontally across the model. And that's because we want any texture to wrap from this side to this side, and that'll become a little bit more apparent when we start texturing, but for now the important thing is to just scale these guys on U only. Now for the bits down here, you can scale these however you want. It is going to be running a little bit slow, just because the advanced OpenGL takes into account a lot of the shading that Modo is doing behind the scenes. But for all of these bits down here, we can just scale these just normally, just on both axes at once. So I'm going to go ahead and start scaling some parts of the model and see if I can get things looking a little bit better, and then I'll come right back. So as you can see, I've finished laying out our lens UV so that the checkered texture runs much more uniformly across the entire model. Now I've also brought back all of our other objects so that we can see everything we've done up to this point, and you'll notice that everything is now UV'd. And if you've got this far, congratulations, because UVing, although not completely difficult all of the time, it can be quite dull. So if you've got this far, I hope it hasn't been too much of a dull experience for you. But at this point, we've basically got a base texture map for every single object in the camera. And what this means is that we can apply a scratch map or a dust map to every single object. However, it's going to be quite difficult to apply graphics or decals to them at this point, and to do that we're going to do something quite specific, utilizing Modo's shader tree. So in the next couple of minutes we're going to go about selecting the polygons on which all of the graphics on the model sit, whether they be on the lens or the top of the camera or the details or anything like that. And when we've got all of those polygons selected, we're going to UV them into their own specific graphics UV map. Then with them in that map, we're going to use that to create all of the textures in the next couple of tutorials. So that's what we're going to do, so without further ado, let's get going. So the first thing we want to do is make all of these objects editable at once. So with everything visible in our items list, I'm going to switch to items mode by clicking 5, and then lasso select around all of the items you can see in the 3D view. This will highlight them all so we can see the texture on all of these objects. I'm then going to click off. I'm going to change our advanced OpenGL shading to shaded, as we don't need to see our checkered texture just for the minute. And with everything visible, I'm going to create a new UV map called graphics. So I'm going to type that in and click, graphics, and click OK. So this is the UV map in which we're going to place all of the polygons on which graphics will be placed on our camera. Now we're going to start with the body sections group, so I'm going to hide everything else, and then zoom into this group and switch to polygon mode and start selecting some polygons. So the first thing we have is the Canon logo that sits in the middle of this section here. So I'm just going to go in and start selecting these polygons here. So it's always good to select more than you need at this point, because you can always delete them later on. And then there's a dot that sits in the middle of this section here, so I'm just going to select these polygons as well. Then on the front here over on the left we have an A1 logo that sits just about here, so I'm going to select rough set of polygons. Something like that, just enough so that the logo will sit in the middle of these. Then I'm going to move around to the back, and we have a serial number that sits on the back of the camera here, so I'm going to select these polygons here, so starting just to the right of this hole in the top of the camera. Then I'm going to switch to the top of the camera itself, and there are a couple of little letters here that mark settings that you can choose as you rotate parts of the winder object. So what I'm going to do is just select a whole bunch of these for the minute, and we can always delete them from the UV map later on if we don't need them. So I'm just going to select all of these items in here, like so, and with all of those polygons selected, that's in fact all we need for this entire group of objects. So making sure that we have the graphics UV map highlighted, I'm going to come over and choose UV projection tool and change our projection mode to Atlas. Now with that in place, I'm going to click once in our viewport, and you can see the different elements laid out over here in UV space. Now I'm going to click space to drop the tool. I'm going to deselect those. In fact, I'm just going to move those off to the left slightly before I do that. So just grab those and move those off to the left. And then we can move on to the next object, which will be the middle details group. So I'm going to hide the body sections group and bring in our middle details. And you can see that our graphics UV map is still visible in our list as we applied it to all of the objects to begin with. Now we need to go ahead and try and see where there are any decals on these objects. And the only place there's actually any kind of decal is this Canon sign at the back. So what I'm going to do is come in and just grab some of these polygons, just these back 9 in here. And with those selected, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. So UV projection tool with a mode of Atlas, I'm just going to click once in the viewport. I'm going to hit space to drop the tool. And I'm just going to drag that down just to get it out of this one-to-one space. Then we can bring in the top details group and start looking at where all of the decals are on this set of objects. So as you can see, I've brought in the top details group and I've actually gone ahead and selected the polygons that we need. I'm just going to quickly run you through all of those. So over here on the right, we have the entire top of this big dial section. This is where we have the ISO or ASA numbers, so all of this is currently selected. I've also selected 2 polygons on this little lever on the top here. There's a little line which is going to be in the middle of those. Now I've selected 2 loops running around the top of this section here, so just not this top one, just these 2 a little further down. There's going to be a bump map running along this. And then finally on this object I've selected a couple of extra polygons on the top here, so just 4 extra above this loop, and there's going to be a little white line on there. And the way to kind of figure out where you select those, if you imagine that it's a clock face and this extrusion here is 6 o'clock, you basically want to kind of choose at around about, I don't know, what is that, 4:30, something like that. So with all of those polygons selected, we're going to move on to the next item, which is this little block here. And you can see I've selected 2 parts of the top set of polygons. I've selected this bit down here, on which there's a little logo, and then this part here, which there is a line running down the middle. Then moving across, we go to the flash object, and there's just a couple of polygons here, on which we're going to put a few semicircles. Moving across a little bit further, we go to the shutter dial box, and I've just selected a huge amount, basically the half of the top of this dial box, which is just going to have a couple of letters on it, a couple of little logos and things like that. I've also selected the entire front of this extrusion on this object, as well as, let's see, 4 polygons above it. So second large set of polygons in, I've just selected those. There's going to be a little white line running on that. Then I think pretty much that's it, except for these dials in here. So on this main big dial, I've selected all of the polygons running around the outside, and I'm also going to go ahead and select all of these faces on the top of the 2 dials that we can see through this hole here. So I'm just going to select all of those guys. And then once you have all of these polygons selected, it's probably a good idea to add them to a selection set. So I'm going to come up to select at the top here. And I'm sorry that's off screen at the moment, but you want to go assign a selection set and then give it a name or whatever you want basically. I've just called mine top details graphics polys, and I'm going to click OK. And basically if you want to get them back, you come down to the statistics panel, and underneath polygons by selection set you'll find that selection set group. So if you deselect your polygons at any point, you can just click the cross and get them all back. So with these selected, I'm now going to click Shift and H to hide all of the other polygons. And then we want to go through and basically UV every single section in here. So I'm not going to go through this on camera. It's essentially exactly the same as we've been doing at this point, if not a little bit easier actually, because we're just doing planes of polygons and flat sections of polygons. There are a couple of little sections like this where we'd have to select some edges to separate up the top of this cylinder from the sides of this cylinder. However, I'm confident that you can do that by now. It's a very simple thing compared to things that we've been doing. So yeah, I'm just going to do this off screen and then come back. So as you can see over here on the left, I've got the UVs that I've laid out now for the middle, the top and the body sections of the camera. And there's really nothing interesting that came up whilst UVing those top polygons we had selected. The only things of note were these 2 sections here, and they are the kind of the loops running around this bump dial and the loop running around this section as well. And all I've done is basically split that down the middle into 2 sections, which just gets us a little bit of a better, kind of less distorted result in our UV map. So now we're going to go ahead and choose the polygons on the lens object where there are graphics. So I've just gone ahead and selected all of the polygons that we need for the lens object, so I'm just going to run you through those quickly. Now the first one is this ring with the grip on it, closest to the body, and I've just selected all of the polygons from the start of the grip on the right hand side up to the button. Then on the next ring along, I've selected these 9 polygons, so kind of in line with the end of this grip, so just one either side. Then I've selected 3 sets of polygons either side of the middle. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3 either side of the middle. Then on this next ring, I've just gone for the top, the entire top half of it, sorry. So from one side all the way around to the other side, just that middle set of polygons in there. And then finally, this final ring just in front of the cap, I've selected the 3 loops running from just about center really, so we're just getting this entire top section. So like that. Now with all of these polygons selected, we could go in and UV them again. However, we already have the UVs nicely laid out for these objects over in the lens base map. So what I'm going to do is just click lens base to activate that UV map to make them visible. And you can see that they're already selected in here. So what I'm going to do is right click on lens base and click copy. Then click on graphics to make that map visible. Right click and click paste. And you can see we paste in those UVs into our new graphics map. So we've already got these really nicely UV'd for us. So now if I bring back all of our objects, you can see that our graphics map is starting to come together. Now all we need to do is align it and make them all kind of roughly the same size to each other and then fit them in the one-to-one space. So we want to do this by assigning a new material to just this UV map. So I'm going to do that now. So I've turned Advanced OpenGL back on and run over to our shader tree. I'm going to turn off all of the materials we've made so far and then click Base Shader. I'm going to click Add Layer and click Image Map. Now I'm going to select the checkered map that we've got so far, and we should see that applied to the graphics UV map that we have selected. Now if it doesn't get applied, we can come down to Properties, Texture Locator, and down the bottom here we select Graphics from the UV map drop-down. Now it's just a case of going in and arranging and resizing all of these elements over here in UV space so that the checkers are similar size across all of these different parts. So as you can see, I've evenly laid out the UVs in this graphics UV map over here on the left so that the checkered material runs nice and evenly across all of these different parts. Now there are a couple of areas where we're getting a little bit of distortion, but we're going to look into sorting that out in the next couple of tutorials. So that's it for this time. I hope you've had fun. I hope you've learned a couple of things and it hasn't been too dull. I know that UVing isn't exactly the most exciting part of the process, but it is a very vital part. So yeah, if I've gone too quickly or haven't covered anything, feel free to leave me some questions below or any comments you might have. There'll be a thread on the Luxology forums as well if you want to post any work in progress or anything like that. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm at badgrenola. That's BADGRENOLA. But until next time, cheers guys.